80 miles southeast of New York City, there is nothing. Open water, the Atlantic in every direction, no marker, no buoy, no monument of any kind to mark what happened here. Somewhere beneath the surface, steel, radar equipment, and the wreckage of a 5-story military installation that the United States Air Force built at enormous expense, kept operational against documented structural warnings, and lost on January 15, 1961. 28 men went into the water. None came out. The Air Force had written reports warning the platform was failing. This is what those reports meant and why the men never left. The question of why those men were out there at all starts with a gap, not a gap in the ocean, but a gap in American radar coverage. In the early 1950s, the United States had built major radar warning networks across Canada, the Pine Tree Line and then the DEW line, stretching thousands of miles to catch Soviet bombers coming over the Arctic. The problem was the Atlantic. A Soviet Tupolev Tu-95 bomber, flying low and fast on a northwestern approach, could cross the Atlantic and reach the American coastline with far less warning than the Canadian networks could provide. Air defense planners ran the numbers. They calculated that shore-based radar gave too little time, somewhere around 4 to 6 minutes, far short of what Air Force interceptors needed to scramble, find, and engage incoming bombers before they reached New York, Boston, or Philadelphia. The solution, on paper, was straightforward. Build radar stations on the ocean itself. 3 shallow water shoals ran along the New England outer continental shelf, close enough to the surface for fixed platforms to reach the bottom. By anchoring radar-equipped stations on those shoals, the Air Force could push its detection ring roughly 100 miles further out to sea, buying perhaps 30 additional minutes of warning time. 30 minutes that, in a world of nuclear-armed bombers, meant everything. The Air Force called the program the Texas Towers. The name came from the look of the platforms, which resembled the oil rig structures that had been punched into the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico since the late 1940s. That visual resemblance also happened to describe the engineering baseline for the program. The platforms were adaptations, not purpose-built Atlantic structures. They borrowed heavily from commercial oil rig design. That was the first problem hiding inside the solution. 3 towers were ultimately built. Texas Tower No. 2 went up on Nantucket Shoals. Texas Tower No. 3 was on George Bank. Texas Tower No. 4, TT4, on George Shoal, roughly 80 to 100 miles southeast of New York City, stood on legs driven into the seabed with its main deck approximately 67 feet above mean sea level. Each platform was a self-contained installation, berthing compartments, a mess hall, communications equipment, and rotating radar antennas on the platform deck that fed detection data into the SAGE system, the Air Force's massive computerized air defense network, which coordinated intercept responses from direction centers along the eastern seaboard. At its normal operating complement, each tower carried somewhere between 70 and 100 people, Air Force radar operators, communications specialists, civilian electronics technicians from defense contractors, and maintenance personnel. They rotated in and out on multi-week tours, arriving by helicopter from shore-based air stations. When they landed on the platform deck, there was no coastline visible in any direction, no harbor, no pier, just the open Atlantic and the sound of the radar antennas turning overhead. The construction cost per tower ran into the tens of millions of dollars in the early 1950s prices, with some accounts putting the figure around $40 million per structure. The program was expensive, visible, and publicly presented as a genuine solution to the Atlantic radar gap. It appeared in Air Force materials. It looked, from the shore, like American technological ingenuity applied to Cold War survival. Then, in August 1957, the Soviet Union tested the R-7 rocket, the first successful intercontinental ballistic missile in history. It did not fly over the Atlantic. It flew through space. A nuclear warhead on an R-7 trajectory followed physics, not a flight path that radar designed to track bombers could read. The Texas towers were built to watch the sky for aircraft. The new threat was already coming from a different direction entirely. The platform legs were being driven into the Georges Shoal seabed, while the strategic logic underneath the whole program was quietly shifting. A Gulf of Mexico oil rig design was being pushed into the North Atlantic winter, and the primary danger the towers were meant to detect was being replaced by a weapon they could not see at all. The radar kept turning. The Atlantic kept moving. Neither of those facts would stay in balance for long. Life on a Texas tower was not what most people imagined when they thought about Cold War military service. There were no runways, no barracks rows, no commissary, no base housing street with children riding bicycles. There was a steel deck over open water, a mess hall where trays slid in heavy seas, berthing compartments where men slept to the sound of the Atlantic hitting the platform legs below them, and a rotation schedule that put you out there for weeks at a stretch before a helicopter came to take you back to shore. The men who rotated through the towers were a mixed company. Air Force radar operators and communication specialists worked alongside civilian electronics technicians employed by defense contractors, firms responsible for maintaining the radar systems and associated equipment. They shared the same confined quarters, the same rough passages, the same card games and film projections in the rec spaces, the same letters written home that probably said less than the writer knew. Military rank structure existed on the platform, but contractor employees answered to different employers. They were two categories of people doing one shared job in one shared machine, and they accepted identical risk. The radar consoles ran around the clock. Operators sat their watches, reading returns across the Atlantic approach corridors, tracking contacts, feeding data to the SAGE direction centers on shore. The system worked as designed. TT2 and TT3 operated without the major structural problems that would define TT4's history. The program, from a distance, looked like a functioning Cold War success. TT4 told a different story from the inside. Experienced rotation crews, men who had done multiple tours on all three platforms, noticed that TT4 moved differently in heavy weather. Not the normal flex and give of a structure in open water, but something else. Vibrations in the frame, sounds from the bracing below the deck that veterans of the other towers did not recognize as ordinary. The platform reportedly earned a nickname among the crews who knew it best, Old Shaky. Whether that name circulated widely before the collapse or spread afterward in the telling is harder to confirm, but the underlying reality the nickname described was real, and it was documented in more official language than a crew's private joke. In September 1960, Hurricane Donna moved up the Atlantic coast. TT4 took damage. The storm hit the structural bracing on the platform's legs, the diagonal members designed to distribute the enormous lateral stress the ocean placed on the structure. And when engineers assessed the platform afterward, what they found went into inspection reports. Those reports existed. Congressional testimony after the disaster confirmed they existed, and confirmed that the Air Force had them. What the report specifically recommended, and in what exact language, is something the hearing transcripts establish more precisely than second-hand accounts. What the evidence shows is this: the Air Force knew the platform's structural condition had been compromised by a major Atlantic storm, and the decision it made was to conduct repairs and return personnel to operational status. The men going back to TT4 after Hurricane Donna were going back to a platform that the institution had assessed, documented, and cleared, and that experienced crew members had, by their own informal accounting, been calling Old Shaky for months. Those two facts existed simultaneously inside the same Air Force program. The paper trail confirmed the damage. The operational logic confirmed the mission. The mission won. Meanwhile, the strategic picture the towers were built to address was shifting faster than the program could follow. Soviet bomber deployments continued, but the R-7 test in 1957 had already signaled where Soviet nuclear strategy was heading. American defense planners knew by the late 1950s that ICBMs represented the primary emerging threat. The platforms were not designed to detect ballistic missiles. They had no radar architecture for that mission. They watched the sky for aircraft, and aircraft were no longer the leading edge of Soviet nuclear capability. The Air Force was simultaneously investing in a parallel answer to the Atlantic warning problem, the EC-121 Warning Star, a long-range radar aircraft converted from the Lockheed Constellation airliner. Mobile, not fixed. Airborne, not anchored. An aircraft could be repositioned, recovered, repaired, and replaced. A steel platform in the North Atlantic could not. The EC-121 program was growing while the Texas towers were deteriorating. None of that strategic arithmetic helped the men on TT-4 in late 1960. Their job was to keep the radar running. The institutional decision had been made. The platform had been cleared. October passed. November passed. December passed. The North Atlantic winter built toward its worst months. The inspection reports sat in Air Force files. The platform stood on George Shoal, antennas turning, legs in the water, while January gathered itself on the horizon. The program had an answer for almost everything except what the ocean was about to do. January 15, 1961, was a winter nor'easter. The storm built over the North Atlantic with the kind of sustained violence that the Gulf of Mexico oil rigs the Texas tower design was borrowed from had never been engineered to survive. Shoreside radio operators tracking TT-4 were waiting for a scheduled transmission. It did not come. They waited longer. Nothing came. The platform had not issued a mayday, not one received in time, not one that reached anyone who could respond before the outcome was already fixed. The silence was the disaster, and it was complete before anyone on shore understood what the silence meant. All 28 men aboard Texas Tower No. 4 died, not in battle, not from a Soviet weapon, from the failure of a steel structure that inspection reports had flagged as compromised 4 months earlier. In water, the platform's original design had not been fully engineered to withstand. During a storm, the North Atlantic produces every winter, as a matter of routine. No survivors. Recovery operations reached George Shoal and found open water. The platform was gone. The casualty list included both Air Force personnel and civilian contractor employees, men who had not enlisted, had not accepted a commission, had been sent to that platform by their employers to maintain radar equipment for a government program. Their deaths arrived without the formal military framework the Air Force used to process its own losses. They had lived the same rotation life, felt the same structural concerns, and died in the same water. Congress convened hearings. The Senate Armed Services Committee produced testimony from Air Force officials and program administrators. What the hearings established, and what the transcript record anchored in documentation rather than allegation, was that the Air Force had possessed structural assessment reports on TT-4's post-Donna condition and had made an institutional decision to return personnel to operational status. The paper trail was specific. The awareness was documented. The decision had been made by real people inside a real chain of command who could be asked, under oath, why they had made it. The accountability that followed was limited. No criminal charges. No dramatic institutional reckoning. The hearings produced a record, and the record has sat in archives where most Americans will never find it. The 28 men received the bureaucratic recognition that the military provides its dead. The civilian contractors received whatever their employers and the government's liability framework offered. The platform received the Atlantic. Within roughly 2 years, Texas Tower No. 2 and Texas Tower No. 3 were decommissioned. The program was wound down quietly, without the public accounting the disaster might have demanded. The Air Force did not hold a press conference to explain that it had built platforms borrowed from Gulf oil rig technology, pushed them into the North Atlantic winter, documented the structural deterioration of at least one, kept men aboard, and lost all of them. The program simply contracted and disappeared. The EC-121 Warning Star aircraft took over Atlantic early warning duty. Mobiles airborne. not anchored to a shoal where the ocean could work on the legs for years while an institution watched. The SAGE system that the towers had fed, the vast Cold War computing network with its massive direction centers processing air defense data across the eastern seaboard, began its own long decommissioning through the 1960s as intercontinental ballistic missiles rendered the aircraft interception architecture increasingly irrelevant. The whole machine the Texas towers were built to serve became obsolete. The towers died in service of a system that also died, in defense against a version of the Soviet threat that Soviet engineers were already replacing with rockets when the first platform was being built. The 30 additional minutes of Atlantic warning time, the entire strategic justification for the program, the calculation that put men on steel platforms 80 miles from shore in the open ocean, those 30 minutes were purchased at a cost that included 28 lives, hundreds of millions of dollars across the full program, and a paper trail of institutional knowledge that the hearings exposed and the years then quietly absorbed. The men on TT4 had no warning at all. The irony is not subtle. It is simply true. Today, at George Shoal, there is no surface marker, no memorial buoy, no plaque visible from a boat. The wreckage of Texas Tower No. 4 lies on the seabed where it fell. Steel platform members, radar equipment housings, the structural fragments of berthing compartments where men slept during their rotation, present beneath the water and invisible above it. The site has reportedly been visited by recreational divers. It has no formal designation, no official access protocol, nothing to help anyone find it from the surface. 80 miles southeast of New York City, the Atlantic shows nothing. The water does not remember the program, the platforms, the inspection reports, the post-Donna decision, or the 28 men. The congressional transcript in a Washington archive remembers all of it. The ocean keeps nothing above the surface. The paper keeps everything else.